Did you know that you can actually hear your name in music? The letters and sounds that make up your name can be swapped out for musical notes. It's called a musical cryptogram, and in this video, I'll show you some famous examples, as well as showing you how you can actually find out what your own musical cryptogram is so that you can spell your own name in music. I'll start with what's probably the most famous example in music history, Johann Sebastian Bach. You might be thinking to yourself, well, I know that there's a B and A and a C on the piano keyboard, but there's no H. And if you are, then you, my friend, have just stumbled on one of the biggest problems with creating musical cryptograms. Here's how Bach solved it. He turned to German musical nomenclature. There's actually a different system of naming musical notes in German-speaking countries. For me, as a native English speaker, and I also happen to learn piano with a native English speaker, I learned 7 note names, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then it repeats back to A, so I'm pretty limited. But the German system opens up some new possibilities. For instance, when they say the note B, they're talking about what I would usually call the note B flat. So what happens if I'm speaking to a German musician and I actually want this note over here, which I would normally call B? Well, that one they would call H. Well, with those two changes, we actually already have enough letters to spell out the name Bach, B-A-C-H. B in German nomenclature would be my B flat. A is the same, C is the same, and then the last H at the end of his name is what I would call B. So when I put together B flat A, C, B, it actually spells out the name Bach, and he incorporated this motive into several pieces. Now the Bach cryptogram is pretty well hidden in a lot of those pieces, but let's turn our attention now to something that's a little bit more obvious. In this next example, I'll share some pieces of music where when you hear them, it's just very, very obvious. You can absolutely hear the cryptogram because it's happening over and over again and it's in the melody. It's there for everyone to hear. This example comes from the Soviet composer Dmitri Shostakovich. It's a bit more intricate. Obviously, we're dealing with a lot more letters than Bach. So to simplify things, Shostakovich is really just encoding his initials, which still turns out to be a lot more complicated than you might think, and here's why. The first name we could represent with the initial D, and that's an easy one because we have D right here. It's one of our 7 letter names on the piano. But what about his last name? Now, I don't speak Russian at all, and I don't speak any language that uses the Cyrillic alphabet. So I hope this is correct, and please correct me in the comments if I'm getting any of this wrong. But from my understanding, that sound that starts the beginning of the name Shostakovich, it makes this kind of sound, shh. And in English, we would represent that with the characters SH. When we put S and H together, we get sh. But in the Cyrillic alphabet, or at least in Russian, there's just one character for that sound, and it looks like this. Now what Shostakovich does is he transliterates this sound into the German system. Well, in English, we make that sound by putting the letters SH together. We get sh. In German, that same sound is represented with 3 letters. You need S, C, and H together in order to make the sound sh. So now we have his full musical initials in our Latin alphabet. It would be D, S, C, H. Well, the D is easy and the C is easy. Both of those are exactly where most of us would think they are. We've also already talked about H by using the German system. But what about the S? Going back to the German system, the note that I would usually call E flat could be represented as S, E-S. So in order to play his initials, we could get D-S-C-H. That would be D, E flat is S, C, and H is what most of us would call B. And I put that together, I get this. This motive is clearly and repetitively stated in so many of Shostakovich's pieces. I would say most famously, it's in his 8th string quartet. If you listen to that 8th string quartet, it'll be so clear to hear that DSCH motive because it's just the fabric that weaves the entire piece together. It's stated clearly in melody after melody. It's transposed up and down, flipped upside down, inverted, stretched out, pulled apart. There's no way to miss it. All that being said, I want to share one more example of a musical cryptogram, and this one is probably just about the wildest story I've ever heard of involving one of these encoded names. It's incredible both in the way that it was constructed and the story that surrounds it. In my experience, it also tends to be a story that for whatever reason, musicians tend to be completely unfamiliar with. Probably because a lot of the story has only been pieced together in the last couple of decades. I just happen to know a lot about it because it was a big part of my doctoral exams. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel so you'll never miss videos like this one. So for this story, we're once again going to talk about Shostakovich, but this time we're going to visit his 10th symphony, and this is a big deal. First of all, because it involves the famous and ominous Curse of the Ninth. What is the Curse of the Ninth? Well, Beethoven composed 9 symphonies. His last and his grandest was the 9th symphony. And since the death of Beethoven, his legacy has sort of haunted many of history's greatest composers. Especially in the generation that just followed Beethoven, there was a tremendous amount of pressure for great composers to try to live up to that example that Beethoven set. The problem is that nobody could really compete with the legend of Beethoven. And composers started to become very superstitious when they noticed that every time a great composer would approach their 9th symphony, it would be their last. Or sometimes just their last attempt, as they would never be able to actually finish the 9th symphony. So many of these great composers came close to a 10th symphony. The composer Gustav Mahler was well aware and very superstitious of this curse. After he finished his 8th symphony, he was terrified of the idea of creating a 9th symphony. So he sort of cheated the system. Instead of writing a symphony number 9, he gave this piece a title called Das Lied von der Erde. He completed what really probably should have been his 9th symphony, and then set to work on another piece called Symphony number 9. And staying true to the curse, that would be his last full symphony. Since the death of Beethoven, Shostakovich became the first very important composer to successfully complete a 10th symphony. Now we're going to circle back to Mahler in just a moment, but first there's one more important historical piece of information we need to discuss. This 10th symphony also represented Shostakovich miraculously outliving Stalin. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Shostakovich's relationship with Stalin, and I'm going to save that as a topic for a different video. While there are still a lot of questions about it, what I will mention is that there are many of us, myself included, who believe that Shostakovich lived most of his life in absolute terror from Stalin. We believe that he was very much an anti-Stalinist and lived most of his life, rightfully so, in fear. Some people have a very different opinion about that relationship, and it's a tricky subject for sure. But if I'm right, then this symphony is important not only because it represents Shostakovich outliving the Curse of the Ninth, but also outliving the reign of Stalin. In the third movement, we hear this French horn call over and over and over again, and the notes sound like this. Now I want you to also listen to the French horn call that's very prominent at the beginning of Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde. Shostakovich was definitely referencing this symphony for exactly the reasons that we think. But the horn call also represented something else. It represented someone's name, and we didn't know about this until very recently. It's the name of Elmira Nazirova, a composer and a former student of Shostakovich, with whom he became romantically obsessed. In 1990, Nazirova opened up a series of personal letters from Shostakovich. Several of them talk about this symphony, and one of them details exactly how her name is encoded in this symphony. This one's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to walk you through it step by step. The first note is E, or in German we might pronounce it E. The second note is the note A, but if instead of calling it A, we describe it with solfege, like many other countries do, then we would get this. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. So we could call the note A, la. The third note goes back to E, but this time instead of calling it E, we'll use the solfege name mi, as in do, re, mi, because it's the third note of the scale. Then we go down to D, but again, sticking with solfege, we'll call it re. That's because it's the second note of the C major scale. Finally, we'll return to A, and we'll use the German pronunciation of A. When we put that all together, it spells out E, la, mi, re, a, or Elmira, as in Elmira Nazirova. In the description of this video, I'm also including a link to my Spotify playlist. And if you go to that link and you listen to the third movement of the symphony, you'll hear this horn call over and over and over again. But what's even a little bit disturbing, I would say, is that you'll hear it enmeshed with the DSCH motive, back and forth, trading places, Elmira, DSCH, Elmira, DSCH, over and over again. Now, if you've gotten this far at this point, you might be wondering, how do I spell my own name in music notation? And I'll share that with you now. We've already discussed a few ways to turn letters into musical notes. You could use the A through G alphabet on a keyboard that most English-speaking musicians are already familiar with. You can combine that with some German nomenclature to get extra letters like S and H. You can supplement that with sounds from solfege, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And for other letters, there's also a French system that works kind of the same way as a child's decoder ring toy that they might get in a cereal box. You play through all the notes A through G. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Then you keep going, but you continue the alphabet. So the next A you would call H, I, J, K. So if I wanted to use a K using this French system, I could use the note D. And I've actually created a very easy to use worksheet where you can kind of see the whole alphabet and all of the different options that you might have from these different systems laid out. It's available to all of my Patreon supporters. If you're interested in getting access to this sheet and more, please find a link to my very new Patreon page in the description of this video. And if you think you figured out your name in musical notation, please drop the notes in the comments. At least for the beginning of this video's life and maybe a little bit beyond, I'll be happy to go ahead and check and see if what you put in makes sense musically. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to subscribe. Thank you, and that's bye-bye.